So for our application, we're gonna be looking at a flyer called Let's Talk About Ignition, and it's promoting an ignition lunch and learn. And so for this example, we wanna treat it a bit like a makeover. We're gonna first show you a poorly designed flyer, and then go on to show you how you can take that same information and make something much more competently designed. So let's take a look at the ineffective design first. So as you can see, this is a pretty extreme example of something that is poorly designed. Um, we know that this flyer design isn't working, but let's talk about why. So first up, let's talk about the layout and specifically grid and alignment to kick us off. Because there's absolutely no alignment between anything in the design, we can't even really see a semblance of a grid at work. There's text and imagery that's centered, some of it's left aligned, and some of it's just floating off into space. The description copy is left aligned, which is helpful for long forms of text, but the long lines stretching across the page make it more of a chore to read. So shortening those line lengths would help establish a grid better, and it would serve the viewer better. In terms of spacing, the spacing between elements doesn't really have a purpose or a rhythm to it, so things just appear to be thrown against the page. When used correctly, spacing can really help guide your eye and determine which information goes together and what needs to stand out on its own. And finally, in terms of contrast, we can see there's definitely some contrast between big things and small things. The problem is there's so many things on the page that are the big thing in quotation marks. And when everything is large, nothing is. So your eye doesn't really know where to go and what it should be looking at. So let's talk about the visual hierarchy now. So in terms of type, multiple typefaces distract from the content. And you can really see that at play here. There's a myriad of typefaces on display. Like he said, you should limit your typefaces to 1 to 2 for a piece of content and try to keep your brand in mind. A typeface does a lot of the legwork to help a reader or a viewer know who the brand is, even if it's at a subconscious level. For those of you in the audience that are familiar with ignition and inductive automation, you could put aside the colors used here, the imagery, the layout, and you could just look at the typefaces and you would know something looks off. Perhaps the biggest problem with this example of a flyer is that it's hard to tell what it's for or what the purpose is. Most of this comes down to the type size and how things are grouped. This is a lunch and learn presented by Inductive Automation called Let's Talk About Ignition. So perhaps that should be the main thing. Free pizza is nice, I love pizza, but that's not the main thing, it's just a nice add-on. So maybe that should be a smaller size supporting the main thing. Also, the date is a pretty important thing to know. And while it's in the center of the page, its size and its color don't really help the viewer. And the same could be said for the call to action. People need to know where to sign up, so hiding that information isn't servicing the reader, especially with it in that light blue color. And speaking of color, color should aid in legibility, not undermine it. In this example, we have a blue background with some text on top of it that's also blue, but we can't see that call to action in that color. So how's the reader going to know where to sign up? So you should always keep in contrast in mind with your color choices because it aids in legibility. And you should also think about your brand with your color choice. Does this color look like my brand? Are these colors we used? And just looking at the colors here, you can say, no, that doesn't look like ignition. That doesn't look like inductive automation. So now let's talk about simplifying this application. So in those first 2 points, everything should have a purpose and remove any unnecessary content. Speaking for this design, it's nice for the reader to have some imagery to grab onto, whether it's to help reinforce your brand or tell a bit about the experience you're promoting. But in this case, a laptop really does neither of those things. So we're promoting a lunch and learn, but this imagery says nothing about the in-person experience. So something like this, the laptop should be removed or replaced with the cutting room floor. Cut down the amount of copy. In the body copy of this example, it's kind of hard to see here, but there's some information about complimentary pizza, giveaway prizes, and the sign up URL. Since this information is already reiterated elsewhere, it's probably best to remove repeat information like this. And just as a note, while reiterating information sometimes helps reinforce something, sometimes it does just the opposite and just adds clutter, making the information harder to digest. So let's talk about some other things to consider. So imagery, we touched on this in the last slide, but when thinking about a main image for your piece of content, whether it's the background image or it's a foreground image, It should really help reinforce the content and possibly your brand as well. So that when someone sees that image just in itself, they say, oh, that's so-and-so, or that's Ignition, that's inductive automation. Another thing to consider is when to use an image and when something like an icon might be more appropriate. An image of a pizza next to the content doesn't really look that appetizing, and it also distracts from the main purpose of this flyer. Using something like a pizza icon would help assist in conveying the message without really being distracting, and it would fall in line a little bit more with our brand and what we do. So now that we've talked about everything not working in this application, let's look at a version of this flyer with some of those fundamentals applied that works more effectively. So here we have what we'll call the more effective flyer. And in terms of its layout, we can see in this example, there is an established grid, and it's working to help lead your eye through that content. It also helps shorten the line lengths of that body copy, making it easier to read, and it leaves room for those supporting elements like the date and the time, and the pizza and the giveaways text. You can also see there's a rhythm to the spacing now, which not only helps this look more aesthetically pleasing, but it also groups information together that should be read together. And if you squint your eyes, you can see there's contrast at play in this application. Even when you glance at it, you're going to know what it's called, and you'll probably see the date and the time as well. In terms of type and color and visual hierarchy, this version of the flyer has more consistency in terms of its typefaces. Inductive automation uses the typeface called Proxima Nova as our main brand typeface, both for headlines and copy. So this is already starting to help identify our brand, even if it didn't have the Ignition logo. This version is also using many of the Ignition brand's colors. This helps identify it as a piece of content about Ignition. And it also creates more contrast, and it calls out to important pieces of information, like that orange block on the bottom that's signifying the call to action. And then in terms of simplification, we've shortened some of the body copies since that date and giveaway and pizza blurbs, they're already shown in other areas. We also swapped out the image to allude to something more applicable to the content of this flyer, but also serve as a background to the main point of this flyer. And we swapped out that pizza image for icons that feel more like our brand and also help communicate the message without distracting from it.